So I want to start with a show of hands. How many people in this room have applied for a mortgage? Can I get a lights up? All right, looks like the vast majority. How many of you, when you applied, did you actually apply online for the mortgage? 2 or 5 hands? Okay. Maybe half a dozen? Yeah, not too many. So Blend is now working with Wells Fargo and many other banks and allowing people to apply for mortgages online with this software, which is pretty new. Wells Fargo just rolled it out in the first quarter. Mary, can you talk a little bit about what was the problem that you were trying to solve? What led you to implement Blend?
It's mainly for our customers. So how do you make it easier? For all of you all who didn't raise your hand, you know the process. You go, you apply, and then you bring your application to your financial institution. Then we come back to you and look for more documents, and then you bring us stuff, and then we come back to you and ask you questions. And this process allows us to cut all of those steps out and make it easier, get those documents for us, for us, allow you not to have to go either looking for that or anticipate, because we're learning to anticipate what it is we'll need, and then frees up our people for the most important parts of the process, where you have questions, you need some advice, you need to understand a component of it that might not be familiar to most Americans who don't do this every day.
Yeah, and Nima, explain a little bit about how this all works. What exactly is your innovation here?
Sure. I think the core of the innovation is what Mary was talking about, which is data instead of documents. Most of you probably get a direct deposit of your bank of your pay stub into your bank statement, and so us asking you to go and find your pay stubs and then send it back to us is sort of a little bit backwards. If we can get access to, if you can give us access to your bank account, or if you're applying through the bank that you already bank with, we should know that about you. And so using that data to greatly simplify the process. And then the other piece is, and we were talking about this earlier, was using that data to also provide transparency of all the roadblocks that are going to happen. Because getting a mortgage, because there's a lot of money changing hands, it's super important for the right questions to be asked of the consumer to make sure that they're going to be able to pay the loan back. And so, but we surface all those using the data up front, earlier in the process. And so I think data and not documents is the centerpiece of what we do. Digital is the centerpiece. I mean, data comes through digital interface because that's the easiest way to engage with customers these days. And so those things together make it so that the customer comes in and they have an amazing experience.
And I know you just started working with Wells Fargo just a few months ago, but they're not the only bank you're working with. How much of the market has already implemented this in terms of the financial institutions?
So we started, Blend started about 6 years ago, and we started, I think we were somewhat controversial in Silicon Valley because we decided from the very beginning we were going to partner with banks, and instead of trying to disrupt them. Everybody at the time, it was Lending Club and SoFi and these companies that were saying we're going to replace all the banks, we're going to build the bank of the future. And we were somewhat controversial and said, no, actually the best way to impact the greatest number of consumers in this space is to partner. And that was controversial because it's something that a lot of people didn't even know if banks would want to partner with us, and I'm very thankful they have. And then the other side of it, I was listening to the previous sessions, and they were all talking about talent and how important talent is. But getting talent to buy into the fact that, hey, we're going to work with all these other companies and we're not going to have complete control over our own destiny is a really scary thought. And it's like, hey, but if we can pull it off and you suspend that disbelief and work with me on that, we can eventually impact a greater number of people. And so we work with about 150 or so banks now. About 24% of the mortgage market, a pretty broad adoption, and continue to grow and trying to help. I think that the future of this is eventually that most financial products that banks offer, they'll be able to do with very little operational effort. With one tap for the consumer, very little operational effort for them, which means a great experience and a lower cost product for consumers. And then for what Mary was talking about, how do you figure out what does that mean for the roles of the people within the bank to help with the customer to understand what those products mean for them in their life.
And what results or outcomes, I guess, have you seen? I know we've talked about the old mortgage process, and this is something that can take over a month for many people. How is this improving things on your end?
So it's done a couple of things. We rolled it out in the first quarter, and by August, we were already at 27% of our total apps are going through the online mortgage application. It's reduced our cycle times. So at the short end, we can improve cycle time by, say, a week. Which is pretty significant over the course of the approval process.
For people who don't know, cycle time is the
total. So from application to closing, we can shorten that time, which is really important to customers. And we've improved our loyalty. So overall loyalty scores have gone up for customers who are engaging with us through the online app as opposed to manually, which we still do a lot of. But even our home mortgage consultants, which are all over the country, if you're interacting with them, they'll send you a link so you can get started. They know it's an easier process, whether you find it in our case on wellsfargo.com or through your mortgage consultant.
Yeah, in your role, you've made a number of changes since you came in, and what you've said, I know before, is that one of your mandates is to regain customers' trust. After Wells Fargo has, I think everybody here knows, been through a few different scandals, and problems with fake accounts and all that. How does this fit into your strategy, whether it's reform or however you see it?
Well, a big part of our Rebuilding Trust initiative is around transparency. So as we talked about, this is a perfect example of engaging customers, increasing transparency, and focusing one customer at a time to improve the experience in a meaningful way, ensuring that the interactions that customers have with us are based on where we can really add value. So I think this is a perfect example of where we took customer feedback and are engaging in a way that's building trust, which, as I said, we're seeing through loyalty scores and in interactions.
Yeah, and you and Wells Fargo CEO Tim Sloan have talked about, the need to change the culture internally. How are you going about doing that? And is Blend part of that?
Blend's absolutely part of that. So as we think about the places where we can focus on the customer experience and rely on Blend as a real partner, not just a vendor relationship, but a true thought partner with us to focus on the technology, it allows us to do what we do best and allows them to do what they do best, that comes together in an innovative experience that takes all that we know about a customer and translates it into a real trust-building experience with a customer.
Yeah. Nima, you actually worked for Palantir for a while before you started Blend. Can you talk about a little bit about what led to this idea? What did you see, whether it was in your work at Palantir or whatever, that kind of made you realize, made you want to start this company?
Yeah, I mean, I had not gotten a mortgage prior to starting Blend. A lot of people, actually, a lot of the sessions previously were about talent and how do you get the right talent so you can start to create that ground-up innovation within your company. And a lot of people who, I think mortgage and financial services are largely ignored because most consumers who are age 23 and leaving college and wanting to go into the tech workforce don't have any experience with a mortgage or anything like that. And so I didn't have any experience, but then I was fortunate, it was right after the crisis, I was fortunate to be able to see firsthand just how much the lack of transparency, the lack of simplicity, how much pain that caused. I was working on some of the most distressed books in the country, the mortgage books, post-crisis, with Palantir. And frankly, I think seeing that and seeing the lack of technology and the possibility for impact was what led us to start Blend in 2012. And frankly, had I not had that experience, I wouldn't have even known how big of a problem and how a paper-based thing, it has a bad impact for you in that 30-day or 40-day process of getting the mortgage. But then there's a whole systemic thing where if you're making a bunch of decisions that are opaque, and then that happens at scale, and then some bad things creep in, bad things can happen. And so I think bringing simplicity and transparency, that's our mission, and that's where we're going to keep going until we get that to be 100%.
Do you think Blend could help prevent the next mortgage crisis?
I don't want to downplay the mortgage crisis and say technology could have solved it. There's definitely, but I think that the lack of technology, the lack of simplicity and transparency, the lack of the ability for data to be used, because data is something that machines can scalably understand and read and review, and so bad decisions around data can be found instantaneously and can be fixed. So I think technology could have played a big role in preventing the ability for these things to not be found sooner. But there were so many aspects to what caused the crisis, so I don't want to downplay the things that happened there.
What do you think, Mary?
I think it's a big part of our go-forward solution as we think about, we also talked about affordability. When you think about creating new homeowners, part of that is access. And this creates access, education, again, focuses people plus technology on the parts of the process that need consultation, explanation. And so I think this combination going forward really allows more people to have access in a way that's understandable, relatable, translatable, and creates home ownership.
But besides the benefit for homeowners or potential homeowners, this also has some advantages for you as the bank, right? In terms of reducing risk, or does it?
Absolutely. So the ability to gather the information, rely on source data that we already have is not only creating a better customer experience, but it's creating a more efficient process for us. If you think about the number of times, as I described it, that we're swapping paper and looping around in the back in the process. So there's certainly efficiency opportunities, and based on the data and the kind of insight that we have, there's absolutely a risk component.
Any questions from the audience at this point? I think I see one over there. Can I get a paddle over here, please? Please tell us who you are.
Hi, good afternoon. Good morning. Nadine Matthews Blair from National Commercial Bank Jamaica Limited. And we have been trying to reinvent and reimagine our mortgage process. And one of the major challenges is the number of stakeholders in the process. So the realtors, the lawyers, the surveyors, the evaluators, the titles registration office. And I wanted to get a sense of to what extent the Blend platform also solves that pain point. And then given that you're now supporting 150 institutions, what then becomes the institution's competitive advantage or differentiator in the mortgage process?
So do you want to start on the stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the stakeholders are, I think of those things as like, we have to go one piece at a time. We went in with the mindset of, and this is I think a good mindset with innovation is like start small, do something that's 10x better for some part of the process, and then grow it. So we definitely haven't solved all of it. Now there are things that we're doing around collaboration with those stakeholders, but there are certain things that are just like you're required to get a physical appraisal of a house, as an example. And so that's an expensive, time-consuming process. If you ever had an appraiser come in and look through a house, like those are not cheap things to do. But we don't need to disrupt everything to disrupt something. And so I think we're taking a very piecemeal approach to it and looking at what parts can be changed by technology, and frankly, not trying to boil the ocean, because starting small is, I think, sort of the essence of what we're trying to do.
And when I think about competitive advantage for us, and every institution is different out of the ones that you work with in terms of what your particular strengths are, for us, quite honestly, scale is a real advantage, because we have a vast number of homeowners in the largest servicing portfolio in the country, and we have 36 million consumer households about which we know all of those data points that can automatically feed the process. So there's a real advantage. And then if you think about, as we project down the road, if you're a Wells Fargo customer that we know buying a property, we know, given the size of the servicing portfolio, we can create an experience that's really second to none by using all of those data sources and inputs into the process, and avoid, hopefully, some of those additional steps that are cumbersome as they are set up today.
Blend has an artificial intelligence component that you guys are using. Can you explain a little bit how that works and what the implications are, I guess, for the consumer who's applying?
Yeah, and I would say like my principle around AI and ML is use it to solve a real problem. And so in this case, a real problem in the mortgage industry is that there's so much manual review of data and documents, and there's so much back and forth that happens as a result of that, where 2 weeks in, somebody can come back to you and say, hey, you know what, I just realized based on the documents that you submitted to us, I need this decree or this explanation. And so because Blend does so much volume now, we do almost 1 billion a day in mortgage applications, we're able to find those kinds of anomalies that come up across that customer base, across that consumer base, and say, hey, consumers like this one institution, hey, consumers like this one have needed these 3 other things that you're going to probably find in 2 weeks. So here's a way to flag it for them right now, upfront in the process. And that does 2 things. That saves time and money for the institution, which making the products lower cost, I think, is part of everybody's desire. But it also saves time and pain for the consumer, who doesn't have to show up 3 weeks later and scramble to get to the closing table on time because they just got their dream home and now they're worried they're going to miss their closing. And so like for me, it's about what parts can technology use to remove friction, and what is the right technology to apply to that problem. And in
So
this case,
go ahead and use your example, although it's not particularly uplifting, but like what kind of documents?
So as an example, if you have, in certain cases for certain products, if you have alimony, you need to provide an explanation of that or proof of that. And sometimes that shows up way later as somebody's reviewing a pay stub 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in. Our system might flag that right away and say, hey, actually, consumer, it's okay, you can still get a mortgage, but here's the things that we're going to need from you. And so let's show that to you right now, give you a flow, a digital flow right then at that moment. And I think that's the essence of the disruption that's happening across all of these industries. I was listening to all these other speakers, is like this real-timeness of everything. And so as a consumer, if you know that about me, ask me right now in real time, don't wait. And so the fact that we can convert this complicated process to real time means that we can make the whole industry just operate a little bit differently.
And does the AI have any bearing on whether people get approved or not?
No, it really is, as Nima said, just shortening the time cycle. Because otherwise, we would find that. We'd have a manual reviewer who went through and saw there was an alimony payment listed, and we'd come back to you and say, oh, by the way, now we need this. But what it's allowing us to do is get the speed to approval improved on the front end to make the experience better.
Any very last audience questions? Right there in the middle, please.
Hi, Karen Sauter with Google. Question, it sounds like based on the way you're working now, you might be able to determine if there's been some bias that you are eliminating through this new process. And I'm wondering, as you work together, if you could share that sort of more broadly so the industry could learn as well.
I mean, one of my favorite stats is that we made this process mobile enabled, and the people who are the biggest demographic to use mobile is not what you'd think. It's not the millennials, it's not the 24-year-olds who are applying for mortgages. It's the lowest income band by far, by a factor of 3. And so like they're so much more likely to use mobile in the mortgage process because it's maybe the only device they have in their home, and it's something that's it's a more accessible way of doing it. And in fact, I have a lot of customers who come to us and say, hey, now that I've opened up this ability to apply in a digital and mobile way and created a simpler mechanism, I'm getting a lot of much lower kind of credit box type applicants coming in. And so in some ways, it's creating that accessibility. And now it doesn't mean all of them are going to get approved for a mortgage, but just opening that ability for those people to apply, I think, is a fundamentally important next step towards making it truly accessible for a broader community.
And it takes the fear out for somebody who might not otherwise want to go in and talk to somebody, but rather I can do it and begin to test in to see if it's possible and then get help where I need it.
Yeah, it's a great way to ease into the banking system.
Nima, Mary, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you guys both so much.